Wonderful. Thank you, Tandra. That was terrific. All right. Next up, we have Zara Anishanslin, who's assistant professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware. She previously taught at CUNY, the College of Staten Island, and at Columbia, where she also co-chaired the Columbia Seminar in Early American History and Culture. Anishanslin was a postdoctoral fellow at the New York Historical Society and Johns Hopkins University, and she received her PhD in the History of American Civilization at the University of Delaware in 2009, where her dissertation won the prize for the best dissertation in the humanities. In 2011, it also won the University of Pennsylvania Zuckerman Prize in American Studies. And that prize-winning dissertation was turned into her first book, Portrait of a Woman in Silk, Hidden Histories of the British Atlantic World, which was released by Yale University Press just this year in 2016. Congratulations, Zara. She can also be found talking history on the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum show. Please join me in welcoming Zara.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank all of you for joining us early in the morning. Just forgive me one moment while I try to figure out how to pull up my PowerPoint, which seems to require a password. Oh, there it is. Okay. Bear with me, it's a long password. There we go. Okay. This is just like when you're trying to give a lecture to undergrads, you have to ask your freshmen how to help you open up the... This is the problem of being a Mac user. You can't do the PCs. There we go. Thank you. Excellent. Thanks. Okay. Apologies for that. All right. It's showing up the way it should be. Again, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Amanda, for the organization of the panel and for including me on it. It's a real pleasure to be here and hear what everyone's working on. And I echo what people have said about integrating public history into our other intellectual pursuits. I think it's really important, and I'm glad to be a small part of it today. So what I'm going to talk about today is teaching, though, and bringing food into the classroom. One of the things I teach is Atlantic World History, and as any of you who study Atlantic World History know, teaching and learning it can be a really depressing thing. It requires thinking about the causes, courses, and effects of some of the more horrific events in early modern history, such as the enforced migration of millions of enslaved Africans to Europe's Atlantic colonies, and the actions of this guy on the right, Christopher Columbus, including the systematic rape, torture, murder, dismemberment of thousands of indigenous people. So, good morning, right? This is a great way to start this off. Yeah, what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that Atlantic World History also has its more uplifting aspects. After all, it's a story of creation as well as destruction. Native Americans, European, and African people came together in cooperation as well as conflict, and exchanges among Native Americans, Africans, and Europeans fundamentally transformed cultures, politics, economies, and of most interest to this forum, food and recipes on both sides of the Atlantic. And chances are, whatever recipes you regularly eat, at least a few of them owe their existence to transatlantic exchange between the 15th and 19th centuries. So beginning with Christopher Columbus's first voyage to the Caribbean in 1492, as all of you I'm sure know, plants, animals, and diseases new to Native Americans arrived in the Americas and Caribbean, while plants, animals, and diseases new to Europe and Africa similarly made a transatlantic journey in the opposite direction. In addition to well-known commodities like tobacco, sugar, coffee, and cocoa that traverse the Atlantic, more prosaic crops, animals, and germs cross the Atlantic at times accidentally. Things like pigs, cattle, horses, wheat, dandelions, rice, and smallpox traveled west. Things like sweet potatoes, corn, turkeys, guinea pigs, tomatoes, and perhaps syphilis traveled east. And such exchange formed the roots of what has become known as the Columbian Exchange after Alfred Crosby's term in his seminal 1972 book of the same name. So as an example of this, I decided to think of what I could do with this in terms of teaching Atlantic world history. And I started with this map as a way to get into this issue of what the Columbian Exchange could bring to the classroom when studying Atlantic world history. When the ship of French explorer Samuel de Champlain ran aground in what he called Port St. Louis in 1605 in modern-day Massachusetts, he described seeing gardens and fields filled with beans and corn, which you can see here, inhabited by Native Americans who met the Frenchmen in canoes filled with freshly caught cod. Native American food and crops captivated the imagination of Europeans like Champlain, and I think this is evident from his map, which took care to illustrate the lushly tall fields of corn as well as the items of navigational interest. So what Champlain called Port St. Louis became better known as Plymouth, Massachusetts. 15 years after his visit, English colonists famously arrived there and described a very different place, a depopulated community so devastated by smallpox that the Native Americans had not even been able to bury their dead and their bones were found on the ground. So such were the disastrous effects of the Columbian Exchange. But what I'd like to talk about today, and what I did with my class, is to think about Champlain's corn in his map. Because in the corn, it also carries, this map, if you'll excuse the pun, seeds for teaching other at times much less devastating aspects of the Columbian Exchange, in particular its impact on global consumption patterns, cuisine, and recipes. Corn, of course, was a fundamental staple in indigenous peoples of the Americas in North and South America, important enough to embody religious meanings to cultures like the Aztecs, who worshiped goddess, who you see here. And corn held very different symbolic meanings, though, across the Atlantic. There, along with tobacco, palm trees, and parrots, and representations of Native American bodies, corn became an iconographic symbol of exoticism, often using maps, paintings like the Dutch one you see there, sculpture, and ceramics. But Indian corn, like many other plants and animals that traverse the Atlantic, ended up on tables as well in Europe, Africa, and Asia. It wasn't just symbolic. So what does teaching and learning about the Columbian Exchange look like if, to take this single example, I asked students to think more deeply about corn? What were the long-term effects of food like corn crossing the Atlantic? What does following a plant like corn back and forth across the sea tell us about changing tastes in Europe and Asia, and about the ability of Native Americans and Africans to retain cultural heritage in no small part through culinary techniques and ingredient choices, and about the hybrid food practices of new Creole cultures established in the Americas and Caribbean. So in my class, one of the things I subject students to, and they usually like it, is Sidney Mintz's fascinating book, Sweetness and Power, The Place of Sugar in Modern History. So they're well aware of the often devastating and destructive, but always transformative effects of people's desire to consume and produce an edible commodity like sugar. But the histories of life and labor on an 18th century Jamaican sugar plantation, and here I'm going to echo what some others have said, can seem like the histories of Native Americans, French, and English in 17th century Massachusetts, very far away and inaccessible to students today. So what would students look at Atlantic world history, what would their view be like through a more personally meaningful lens due to their understanding of these faraway histories of contact and exchange? What would choosing recipes they love based on food that migrated transatlantically through the Columbian Exchange tell students not only about the past, but offer them a chance to reflect upon the past through the lens of their own families and taste buds? How would it illuminate the theoretical concept of something like creolization? What would happen, in short, if students researched the recipes of the Columbian Exchange? So this is exactly what I asked my students at CUNY to do, and I should say here that I think that one of the reasons this worked so well was that I was teaching at CUNY, which is a very diverse population, many students of color. In particular in this class, I had a majority of Latino and African American students, and that was actually a really great way to explore their own personal heritage as a way to understand Atlantic world history. What I asked them to do was to choose a recipe. The only criteria were that it has to be one that would not exist were it not for the fact of the Columbian Exchange, and it must be an actual recipe with more than one ingredient. So I didn't want them to say, you know, corn, right? So they actually had to be a recipe. They had to describe the recipe, its ingredients, its name, and provide information on how it's cooked. And then second, go into more analytical and historical detail about it. What were the environmental origins of its ingredients? Which ones are those we can trace to the Columbian Exchange? Who first made it and where? Why is the recipe important to you? And what does it tell us about the contact between peoples and the exchanges of things that characterized Atlantic world history? Now, as you might guess from the slide that's currently up, the students' initial reaction to this was not positive. as one of my best students, Jose Hernandez, summed up the initial reaction to finding a recipe assignment on the syllabus. When you first assigned the Columbian Exchange assignment, I honestly assumed that you were giving us busy work. Always what a professor wants to hear. However, once the students dove into the assignment, their reactions quickly changed. To quote Jose again, once I started researching, I realized that this is a legit assignment. Yes, it was legit, and it actually, in the end, I think was very successful. It enhanced student understanding of the Columbian Exchange as a truly transformative global phenomenon and gave students a personal thing, tangible thing to hold on to as they struggle to understand this faraway history. It also provided them with new and at times surprising knowledge about their favorite foods. And we did this right before Thanksgiving, and many of them came back after the Thanksgiving break to tell me that this had become a lively topic of conversation at their Thanksgiving dinner table. So, you know, if nothing else, hearing that the history class knowledge went out to a family dinner table, that's a win, I would say. So let me highlight just a few things that the students contributed, because I think that they are interesting and informative. One of the things that many students focused on was meat. So among things that Europeans introduced to the Americas were the meat of pigs and cows, and they became staple features of creolized cuisine, but many students didn't realize that these were not things that were in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange. And students worked on a number of these recipes. Student Brian Howell, for example, who was engaged to a Puerto Rican woman, said that this was a way for him to feel connected to, he was of primarily Anglo descent, and he said this was a way for him to feel really connected to his fiance's family. He researched the empanadilla, which he said had to, quote, make a lot of trips back and forth across the Atlantic to be what it is, and what it is freaking delicious. And so he found this was a way for him to really connect to his fiance's family, as well as I suspect that he made her cook it for him, which is another issue altogether. Another student, Cynthia Vera, researched another meat-based recipe, one that she termed a Latin spin on a European croquette, and here you see her recipe here. And she really enjoyed doing this because it was something that her grandmother cooked for her, and she felt that this was a really interesting way for her to connect with her grandmother across generations as well, discussing this. So while the beef that was a result of European colonization was, coming across the Atlantic this way, corn and potatoes were essential to American indigenous people's diets and went the other way. And as Cynthia Vera actually put it when she was researching her rellenos de papa, growing up Puerto Rican and Ecuadorian, I did not get the sense that my culture was heavily influenced by anything but other Hispanic cultures. But researching her chosen food, she found otherwise, and qualified recipes like rellenos de papa as speaking volumes to the original cultures that did not allow themselves to be swallowed up, but instead were reborn into something else that has become a signature for today's people. And in particular, she focused on potatoes and corn as what she called ingredients of abundance, which I thought was a really great phrase, and I'm going to steal from her all the time. So the other thing that many students focused on was the use of rice in dishes, in particular as a way to trace the retention of African labor techniques as well as culinary techniques, despite forced enslavement across the Atlantic. And a number of the students who looked at these dishes really enjoyed tracing that retention of African heritage. Another group of students, on the other hand, focused on recipes that traveled east from the Americas to Europe and eventually India and Asia, which was really interesting. Some had legends attached to them. Student Ashley Olivetti delved into her grandmother's Italian red tomato sauce recipe and found, among other things, that Europeans at first feared tomatoes in part because they're part of the family, including deadly nightshades like belladonna, a poisonous plant that, according to Germanic folklore, witches used to summon werewolves. So she found this revelatory because she never thought, thinking about her Nona's red sauce would lead her to witches and werewolves, but another interesting dinner table conversation. Other students looked at recipes that arose due to the far-flung empires of countries like Britain going out of the Atlantic and into the Pacific, and this was particularly fascinating. One student, Remy Rodney, researched his grandmother's Jamaican soup, a dish that reflects the global reach of the British in its chicken, pumpkins, yams, and Korean dumplings. Student Harmon Chan, who's of Japanese descent, looked at Japanese rice and potato curry and found that it was first found in Japanese cookbooks in 1872, and it's now a very popular standby in Japan. but it had its beginnings not long before it first appeared in this cookbook, after American Commodore Matthew Perry's 1853 visit began a new era of Japanese trade with Western nations, including Britain. And among the things that the British introduced to Japan were curry from India and potatoes from America. So Harmon's recipe looked at not just how the Atlantic world and Columbian Exchange created new cuisines, but also how that melded with the expanse of the Atlantic into the Pacific, which, as a historian from a historiographical perspective, I find really fascinating because it's sort of what is happening in the field of Atlantic world history writ large, right? We're being told now that the Atlantic's not enough, we need to go Pacific and we need to go global. So this is what the food was doing before us. So to sum it up, as one student put it, food is one way people define their cultures. And as students learned by researching recipes of the Columbian Exchange, food is one way people maintain old cultures and create new ones too. And I found this to be a really successful way of making the 15th and 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, which feel so far away for students so often, things that were personally meaningful. And if nothing else, I don't know what else they'll remember from this course, but I know for sure they'll remember researching these recipes and the fact that some of these things exist because of transatlantic exchange. And in their case in particular, one of their big takeaways was that this was an inspirational story to counter the so often destructive story of enslavement and rape and torture and murder, that this was something that was about creation and retention. And so they found it a really inspirational counterpoint to some of those other narratives. And to conclude, if you're wondering, we did have a feast, and it was delicious. So thank you.